Hi, Year 12. This is a video about Mahayana Buddhism, designed to just kind of give an overview of the main things that are important to know about Mahayana Buddhism before we start to look at it in those different things in more detail. So there are 7 things that we're going to look at. All I want you to do is print off the slides, which I'll send you, and kind of annotate the slides as you watch the video. So we're going to look at what is Mahayana Buddhism. We're going to look at what the Mahayana Sutras are. We can look at skillful means, which is a teaching within Mahayana Buddhism. And then we're going to look at 3 more teachings. The 3 bodies of the Buddha, which I think we've looked at before. The Bodhisattva path, which there's another video on in more detail. And the perfection of wisdom, which is a teaching about the nature of reality according to Mahayana Buddhism. And then I'm going to look briefly at the question of how did Mahayana Buddhism begin. Lots of these things, particularly the Bodhisattva path, the perfection of wisdom, how did Mahayana begin, are going to be topics we're going to look at in their own right in more detail. I just want to give you some awareness of what they are before we begin, because it helps to have an overview. The other stuff is more important as background. Well, the 3 bodies of the Buddha is quite important actually, because that feeds into essays on topics that you've already done, like the nature of the Buddha. But the other things are there because they're important background knowledge of what Mahayana Buddhism is. Okay, so what is Mahayana Buddhism? This is the first part. So Mahayana Buddhism was a new movement in Buddhism which was based around the creation or discovery of new teachings claiming to be teachings of the Buddha. The point is that according to Mahayana Buddhists, they discovered these teachings that were real teachings of the Buddha. According to critics of Mahayana Buddhism, they were created. They're not real teachings of the Buddha at all. When Mahayana started, there were already many different schools of Buddhism. So there were a lot that it wasn't like there was one Buddhism and then Mahayana started. Often people think that there was Theravada and then Mahayana began. It's not quite like that. There were lots of different schools of what we call pre-Mahayana or early Buddhism. However, the differences between those schools were pretty minor. They were very small differences, at least from our point of view now, looking back, they seem quite small. Each of these schools, when I say school, I just mean a kind of a group of Buddhists. So, school. Yeah, that might be worth saying. School within religious studies means like a group of people who follow that religion. And when there are 2 different schools, each one thinks that they are the true followers of that religion. So in early Buddhism, it divided between different groups who all thought that they were the proper ones of that religion. But like I say, the differences were quite minor. And each of these early schools of pre-Mahayana or early Buddhists, they all followed a version of the Tripitaka. The Tripitaka, or 3 baskets, you might want to annotate that's what that means, are the early scriptures of Buddhism. You are used to using the term Pali Canon because that's the Theravada word for that's the term we use to refer to the Theravada version of the Tripitaka. But all these Tripitakas were largely the same. They're all contain the suttas, teachings of the Buddha, the Vinaya, which is the rules for monks and nuns, and the Abhidharma, which is the higher philosophy of Buddhism. So that was pre-Mahayana Buddhism. You have these different forms of Buddhism. They've got slightly different scriptures, but overall the differences are not that important for our purposes. Now, Theravada is the only surviving non-Mahayana school. So all the other schools have either died out completely, or if they survived, once Mahayana Buddhism came in the end, everyone in that school completely accepted Mahayana Buddhism, and so those schools don't exist in their original form anymore. They exist in a form which has kind of been overtaken by Mahayana Buddhism. So that's the way to think of it. Theravada, it's not right to say that Theravada Buddhism is just the first Buddhism and then Mahayana came along. Theravada Buddhism is just the only form of Buddhism surviving today that continues to reject the Mahayana scriptures. It's still just based on its Pali Canon, the Tripitaka. It just accepts those and it doesn't accept the new scriptures. All the other schools that did just accept the Tripitaka, those schools have either disappeared, just died out over time, or that, if you go to, say, Tibetan Buddhism, which is where they have Mahayana Buddhism, that some in Tibet, they follow a certain version of the Tripitaka. But they also follow the Mahayana scriptures on top of that. So it's only the part of the Theravada that just accept the Tripitaka. People often think of Theravada as early Buddhism, and this is indeed how Theravada Buddhists tend to think about their own religion. So Theravada Buddhists would agree that they teach early Buddhism. However, it's more complicated than this, really. Like all religions, Theravada developed over time, and there are certain teachings in Theravada that date from after the Mahayana scriptures came about. So it's not quite true to call Theravada early Buddhism. The thing that really defines it as early Buddhism, I suppose, is that I think this is the next one. The key thing that makes Theravada early is that they reject the authority of the Mahayana scriptures. They stick to the scriptures that come from before the Mahayana scriptures began to be written. It's all very complicated, and if you were talk to Buddhist scholars about this, they would tell you that there are actually things in the Pali Canon that come from a much later date, that the Pali Canon actually got changed or bits got rewritten over time, and so not everything goes back to before the Mahayana scriptures. But there's still a fundamental difference, which is the Pali Canon claims to go back to the Buddha, even the bits that we don't feel that modern scholarship might want to question. It all claims to be the words of the original Buddha who walked around on earth. Now, the Mahayana scriptures are a little bit different. They acknowledge the fact that although they claim to be going back to the original Buddha, they acknowledge the fact that they were disappeared or at least lost, or no one knew about them for a long time, whereas the Pali Canon claims that it's just taught by the original Buddha and handed down over time. That's the difference. I hope that's not too confusing, but that's the basics. Here's a little bit about Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. You've got like a map there where you can see the kind of main places where you have Mahayana and Theravada today. So Theravada is dominant in like what we call Southeast Asia. We got Burma, Thailand, Laos, Sri Lanka, parts of Vietnam too have a lot of Theravada Buddhism. Cambodia there is on Mahayana. I know that Cambodia's got a kind of complex history, but I think Cambodia today has more Theravada Buddhism. It's my belief. Now, then the countries that are dominated by Mahayana Buddhism, you have Tibet, which is now part of China. China historically was a strong Mahayana Buddhist country. Obviously, the situation is complicated in China now because the history of communism means that Buddhism was in retreat for a long time. It didn't have wasn't as strongly followed. But there is still Buddhism in China, and now it's more easy for people to practice their religion to some extent. Then you've got Korea, another strong Mahayana Buddhist country. Obviously, the difference now is that Buddhism is alive and well in South Korea, whereas Buddhism is officially not present in North Korea because it's a communist country. And then Japan, which they have Mahayana Buddhism is a very strong presence in Japan as well. Now, the name Mahayana means great vehicle. So Maha is great, Yana is vehicle, or it can mean way, like a path to follow. So it could be the great path or the great vehicle. It can mean either thing. And Mahayana scriptures refer to non-Mahayana Buddhism. So that would today be Theravada, but any form of non-Mahayana Buddhism, as Hinayana, which means the small vehicle. Now, Theravada Buddhists do not like people using the term Hinayana to describe their form of Buddhism because they don't think that theirs is the small or the lesser vehicle or the lesser way. They think that theirs is the great way, the way that the Buddha taught. They think that theirs is the best way. So when you see those terms, Mahayana is specifically a term which is saying this is the better way, and the other way, the Hinayana, is not as good as our way. A little bit more. Mahayana, it's also important to say Mahayana is an umbrella term. So I found this on an umbrella to explain what an umbrella term is, right? EDM is electronic dance music, I believe. Although they never used to call it that when I was young, but apparently that's the term you use for it now. And then all of these, that's that overarching genre, right? EDM, and then all this other music: house, techno, garage, drum and bass, progressive, tech house, glitch, new disco. I mean, what is that? All that stuff, trance, all that stuff is that they're all different kinds of electronic dance music. And that so when I say Mahayana is an umbrella term, what it means is it's a term that covers lots of different kinds of Buddhism. It's a bit different in Theravada because, at least in theory, although it is complex, but at least in theory, Theravada is one form of Buddhism, and so therefore, throughout different parts of the Theravada world, wherever you go, Theravada Buddhists believe basically the same things. With Mahayana Buddhism, it's more complex than that. There's lots of kind of Buddhists who call themselves Mahayana. There are things that they do share in common. For example, the acceptance of the Mahayana scriptures and the acceptance of the Bodhisattva path, something we look at. Those are the two things that all Mahayana Buddhists basically share in common. But beyond that, just because two people are Mahayana Buddhists, it doesn't mean they believe in necessarily the same things. One particular reason for that is that there are many, many Mahayana sutras, very, very many, and they don't all teach the same kind of stuff. Some focus on one thing, some focus on another. So you might get some Mahayana Buddhists focusing on one set of scriptures, and therefore their teachings kind of are based on that set of scriptures, and another focus on another set of scriptures. So, for example, we're going to look at Japanese Buddhism in year 13, and we're going to look at Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. And Pure Land Buddhists and Zen Buddhists are both Mahayana Buddhists. So they both believe in the Mahayana scriptures. They both believe in the Bodhisattva path, but they focus on different Mahayana sutras, and therefore the way they practice their Buddhism and the things they focus on are quite different. So that's just something you need to know about Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, what are the Mahayana sutras? Here are some examples. There's the Dalai Lama holding a sutra. There's another sutra. I think that might be like one of the earliest printed things in the world. Because I believe the earliest example of printing is a Mahayana Sutra from China. Anyway, those are the pictures of the sutras. So what are sutras? Well, sutras are books, holy books, so that's what a sutra is, a holy book. So what are the Mahayana Sutras? They're new scriptures that emerge claiming to be the authentic teachings of the Buddha. Mahayana Buddhists claim these teachings were hidden or lost, only to emerge again hundreds of years after the Buddha died. So they came out a long time after the Buddha died, so it needed some kind of explanation. Where have these teachings been? Sometimes the idea is they were lost. Other times it's kind of they were hidden. I read in some book that it said they were hidden only to emerge when people in the world were ripe enough to understand the teaching. So the idea is that they were kind of waiting. Someone that the Buddha say was waiting for people to be ready for these teachings. Now, when did they start to emerge? Well, we have definite evidence that the Mahayana Sutras existed by the end of the 2nd century CE, so about the year 200. CE means Common Era. It's just the word that's used to describe what we call AD. But just because AD is a Christian term, other people prefer to use CE. Then you've got BCE, which is for before the Common Era, or we use BC. So they definitely existed by about 200. Most scholars today think the first Mahayana Sutras were probably produced sometime in the 1st century BCE, so like sometime between 100 and 0 BC. I mean, you might think, well, how do they know those things if they didn't have any definite evidence of them existing? But the truth is that scholars have ways of doing this through what they call textual criticism. They read the texts or the books very carefully, and they have different ways of working it out. It's quite an interesting process of working out when they might have been written. So most scholars, people who study this stuff, think they were written about the 1st century, sometime between 100 and 0 BCE. Now, there are many Mahayana Sutras, and they do not all teach the same thing, as I've said. What unites them is the commitment to the ideal of the Bodhisattva path, and I'll come back on to that later on. So that is something that all Mahayana Buddhism, all Mahayana Sutras will have in common. Here are some kinds of Mahayana Sutras. So you can often put different Mahayana Sutras into different groups. There are different groups that have similar content. The first one, though, is not a group, it's the Lotus Sutra. So here I just want you on your slides to write down a few notes about it. The Lotus Sutra is probably the most famous Mahayana Sutra and probably the most influential too. It's a very long sutra, so it's got a lot of information in it. But the main things that it contains, the things that are important for us, I suppose, are it contains the teaching of skillful means that we're going to look at soon. It contains the teachings about the different ideas about the nature of the Buddha, the Mahayana idea about the nature of the Buddha, and it contains stuff about the Bodhisattva path. So that's important stuff. Second set that we'll look at here, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Well, they teach the teaching of emptiness or shunyata that we're going to look at later, and we're actually going to do a whole unit on this teaching. So it's their new teachings about the nature of reality from a Mahayana Buddhist point of view. The Pure Land Sutras are all about the Buddha Amitabha, or Amida as he's called in Japan. So they're the basis of Pure Land Buddhism, and they're all about the story of that Buddha and the promises he made to set up this Pure Land where anybody who calls on his name can be reborn, and from the Pure Land it's more easy to get enlightenment. Lastly, the Tathagatagarbha Sutras. Tathagatagarbha means the womb of the Buddhas, or the embryo of the Buddhas. These are the sutras which teach about something called Buddha nature. I'm not going to look at on this video, but we're going to look at it. It will become significant when we look at Zen Buddhism. So Tathagatagarbha Sutras look at this thing of the Buddha nature, which we did mention in GCSE. Buddha nature is the idea that everybody has Buddha nature within themselves, and to get enlightened, all you have to do is reveal your inner Buddha nature. So those are some of the different kinds of sutras you have, and the form of Mahayana Buddhism. Different forms of Mahayana Buddhism focus more on one set of scriptures or another. Okay, let's get into some of the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. So, firstly, skillful means. This is pretty straightforward. So, in Sanskrit, and most Mahayana sutras were written in Sanskrit, an Indian language, ancient Indian language, which is very similar to Pali, but not quite the same. This term for skillful means is Upaya Kaushalya. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Upaya Kaushalya. Now, skillful means is the idea that Buddhas have the skill to know which teachings will work best for each person they teach. So they're so wise, Buddhas, that they know which teachings will work best for you when they meet you. Now, because of this, sometimes Buddhas may teach things which are not completely true, because this will be best for the person they're teaching. So they might teach something to someone which isn't completely the truth, because that person is not wise enough or not in a position to understand the complete truth at that stage. Now, this is important in Mahayana Buddhism because it's often used to explain differences between the Pali Canon and the Mahayana Sutras. So in other words, particularly about the question of why, and we'll go into much more depth on this on the other video I'm putting up, which is about the Bodhisattva. There's this question of why in the Pali Canon, the Buddha doesn't teach everyone to become a bodhisattva. He teaches people to take the quicker route to enlightenment, being an arahant. Why does the Pali Canon say that, when in the Mahayana scriptures he says, no, you shouldn't become an arahant, you should become a bodhisattva? Now, the explanation that's given is skillful means. In other words, the Buddha taught one thing in the Pali Canon because he knew that the people around him wouldn't really understand the true teaching. And then he reveals the true teachings later when people are more mature enough or wise enough to understand the true teachings. So that's skillful means. Okay, the three bodies of the Buddha, I think we've looked at, I'm pretty sure we have, in year 12 when we looked at the nature of the Buddha, quite early on in the year. Because we looked at, like, this is what the Theravada thinks and then this is what Mahayana thinks. But it's worth going over again. I'll be quite quick here, though. So pre-Mahayana view of the Buddha is this, that the Buddha on earth is the real Buddha. That was the Buddha. He's not the only Buddha, because there are historically lots of different Buddhas, but there can only be one Buddha at a time. For a new Buddha to come along, that Buddha has to die and disappear from the earth, and then the teachings of that Buddha have to die. So it takes lots and lots of time until a new Buddha comes along. And after death, Buddhas disappear from samsara. That's the third belief from pre-Mahayana Buddhism. Here's the Mahayana view. And you can add some notes here on your slides for each one. So according to Mahayana view, the Buddha has three forms called three bodies. But it's more complicated than that, because it's more like there are three forms in which the Buddha exists, or something like that. The Dharmakaya, or the Dharma body, is the first one, and that is the essence of a Buddha, and it really just means the qualities, the wisdom, the compassion that makes someone a Buddha. This is it's arguable, but many people think this is not too dissimilar from Theravada Buddhism, because according to Theravada Buddhism, what makes someone a Buddha is that they've achieved enlightenment, and therefore they have complete wisdom and complete generosity and complete compassion, and so on and so on. So it's those qualities are the true essence of a Buddha. It's not a thing that you can touch or see. It's the qualities that make you a Buddha. It's 2 and 3 where things get more complicated. The Sambhogakaya, or the enjoyment body, that is the Buddha, the form of a Buddha living in his Buddha land. So sometimes you have the Pure Land, sometimes they're called Pure Lands, sometimes they're called Buddha Lands. These are places or worlds somewhere else, not in our world, where the Buddha lives and teaches. And in this enjoyment body, this is a kind of supernatural being. It can have many arms or can have magical powers, and so on and so on. So the Sambhogakaya is a more glorified, or sometimes it's called cosmic Buddha, who lives in this other land. Now, according to Mahayana scriptures, this is nearer to the real Buddha. So the Buddha on earth is not the real Buddha. This Buddha in the enjoyment land, in the Pure Land, is nearer to being the real Buddha with all these cosmic powers. And when Buddhas die on earth, the Buddha in the enjoyment land continues to in the Pure Land continues to stay there to teach other people. So that means Buddhas don't disappear from samsara after they die. They continue to exist in their Pure Land, so they can be prayed to and contacted, and people can go and live in the Pure Land after they die, so that they can get to enlightenment more quickly. That's supposed to reflect the compassion of the Buddhas. It's supposed to be that the Buddhas have so much compassion that they could disappear from samsara. They're not trapped in samsara like we are, but they want to stay here to help other people. So that's the enjoyment body. Lastly, the Nirmanakaya, the transformation body, that's the bodies of Buddhas that you see here on earth. So, for example, the body of Siddhartha Gautama. Now, the idea in Mahayana is that those are not the real Buddhas. In fact, that they are something of an illusion. That the Nirmanakayas are images or illusions that the Buddhas in the Pure Lands send down to earth in order to teach people. So, from that point of view, the struggle of Siddhartha to get enlightened, and his all that stuff that he did to get to enlightenment, was all a bit of a show or something that wasn't real, because he wasn't the real Buddha. He was sent down, a kind of illusion sent down to earth by the Buddha in the Pure Land to assist people on earth. And so when he dies, yes, that Nirmanakaya just disappears, but then the true essence of that Buddha is still existing in the Pure Land now. Now, this Nirmanakaya Sambhogakaya thing has another implication in terms of differences from pre-Mahayana Buddhism, which is, as I said, pre-Mahayana Buddhism said that when the Buddha dies, he disappears. We had that one already. When the Buddha dies, he disappears. They don't agree with that. He stays in the Pure Land. But also, because of that, there's a new teaching about how many Buddhas there can be at one time. There can be many different Buddhas at one time, because Buddhas, once they die, don't disappear. So if you were waiting for all the Buddhas to die before you became a Buddha, you'd never get there, because those Buddhas aren't disappearing. They're all living in their Pure Land. So for Mahayana, there can be multiple Buddhas, many Buddhas living in the universe at the same time, all in their different Pure Lands. And that opens up this possibility, as we'll see, that anybody can become a Buddha. It's actually, rather than it being like pre-Mahayana, it's only the path for a few individuals. For Mahayana, everyone can become a Buddha and have their own Pure Land. Okay, Bodhisattva path. This is what I'd call the defining teaching of Mahayana Buddhism. And what I mean is that what we mean by Mahayana Buddhism is largely Buddhists who accept the Bodhisattva path. Obviously, that's based on the fact that they accept the Mahayana scriptures, but what defines the Mahayana scriptures as Mahayana is that they are scriptures which accept this teaching about the Bodhisattva path. And I'm doing a whole video on this. It's already online. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but all the difference is this. In pre-Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva path, which is the path leading to becoming a Buddha, not to becoming an arahant, just someone who's enlightened, but becoming a Buddha, which is different. For pre-Mahayana Buddhism, that was just the path for a minority, a very small number of people, a few kind of heroic individuals who are willing to undergo the very long training needed to become a Buddha could do it. But for most people, no, you just get enlightened, which is different. In Mahayana, it says that's wrong. That actually the Bodhisattva path leading to becoming a Buddha is the path for everyone. So everyone should be trying to become a Buddha. Again, there's more in that in the other video. Perfection of wisdom. There's a whole unit on this. So, this is just the very beginning, but it's worth knowing about at the beginning to know about it to start with. So the perfection of wisdom is a teaching about the ultimate nature of reality. So the Bodhisattva path we just looked at is a teaching about the goal for Buddhists. This is more about the way that reality is, how to understand the way in which the world is. Now, so it's a bit like Plato's cave. That was Plato's theory of forms. That was his teaching about the ultimate nature of reality, the forms. This is the Mahayana teaching about the ultimate nature of reality. Now, pre-Mahayana Buddhism already has teachings about this. For example, anatta, everything has no self. Anicca, all things are impermanent. Dependent origination, everything is based on a cause, and when the cause disappears, that thing disappears. All of those are teachings about the nature of ultimate reality. And it's important to note that Mahayana Buddhism accepts those teachings. It accepts anatta, anicca, dependent origination. They see perfection of wisdom as not a new and different teaching, but as a logical extension of those teachings. You might ask then, well, why did they bother to teach it? Well, that will be cleared up when we look at it in more detail, because it is quite complicated. Now, what is the teaching of the perfection of wisdom? So the perfection of wisdom is a kind of sutra, Mahayana Sutra, and what they teach is simple. They teach that everything is characterized by shunyata. Shunyata means emptiness, and what this means is that all things lack permanent or inherent existence. Now, you might be already thinking, well, that sounds like it, nothing's got permanence. That sounds like anicca, and you would be right. It is very similar to anicca. In fact, the debate, one of the key debates within this, and something there will be an essay question, is the perfection of wisdom teaching of emptiness a new teaching, or is it just another way of expressing the truths of anicca and anatta? That's the debate that we're going to look at. I would say most scholars would say that it's actually just another way of expressing the truth. So this is a way in which Mahayana Buddhism has new terminology or uses terminology in a new way, but perhaps isn't actually going against the teachings of early Buddhism. Okay, last thing, how did Mahayana Buddhism begin? So this is actually a subtopic as well. Like looking at, well, what was it that caused, or how did it start early Mahayana Buddhism? Now, the interesting thing about this is that there are two views about this. There was one view that people used to think, and then there's now a new view that people think today. So it's quite an easy subject to write an essay on in one way, in the sense that it's really clear which view is right. There's one view that's a kind of old and now disproved view, and another view which is the new view. So here's the early view first. Early scholars, when I say early scholars, I mean people outside of Buddhism who were studying Buddhism for the first time. They thought that Mahayana was a movement led by lay people. That means not monks and nuns. It was thought that these lay people found pre-Mahayana Buddhism too difficult to practice and wanted a religion more focused around devotion and worship, so praying to people, and less around meditation. According to this view, Mahayana began as a breakaway group and originally had no monks. So the idea was, this is what they used to think. You had mainstream or early Buddhism, pre-Mahayana Buddhism, and then lay people, the lay followers found it difficult. For their idea was monks and nuns liked it because it's all about meditation and this, spending long hours in meditation, trying to get to nirvana. And you can't, and it's very self-sufficient religion. The Buddha said, "Be islands to yourselves." He wanted people to do things for themselves. But for lay people who haven't got the time to sit around and meditate all day, it just became too daunting or too difficult. They wanted an easier religion where they could ask for help from other people. So this is what the early scholars thought. They thought those lay people broke away from the monks and started their own kind of Buddhism, where they essentially were just worshipping Buddhas, praying to Buddhas for help. You can see how this fits in with bits of Mahayana. You can see a bit of why they might have thought it, because in Mahayana Buddhism you have the idea that the Buddha's in his Pure Land and you can pray to the Buddha and that kind of stuff. And so you can have some sense of why this makes sense, that lay people would like it more than monks. However, that view has now been completely disproved. So recent research suggests that top view is wrong. The research suggests that actually Mahayana was begun by monks. Secondly, that the first followers of Mahayana were not forming a new kind of Buddhism. They stayed in their old monastic group, so they stayed within the old forms of Buddhism, but they'd begun to follow the new teachings at the same time. So what it's trying to get you to imagine is not that a load of people in mainstream Buddhism thought, right, forget that kind of Buddhism, I'm starting my own Buddhism. No, what happened is these were monks who were in the monasteries, reading the Tripitaka and following mainstream Buddhism or early Buddhism, but then they started to find these books or be influenced by these books, and gradually some people within mainstream Buddhism began to accept these books. So the idea was you might have a monastery, maybe there was a monastery of 100 people, and you might have like 10 people in that monastery begin to think, we're part of this monastery, we're going to live our lives pretty much the same, but also these new books become important to us. And it was only later now, it's now thought that it was only later that whole forms of Buddhism became Mahayana. That's just a gradual development over time. So at first it was more mixed together. Thirdly, it's now thought that instead of being an easier path, many early followers of Mahayana were dedicated to meditation and to following strict rules. So it wasn't at all, if you read the earliest Mahayana scriptures, they're not at all about having an easier time, just pray to someone to do stuff for you. No, the early Mahayana scriptures actually focus a lot on meditation, meditating a lot, following the rules for monks really strictly. So it's kind of the opposite of what they used to think. So when we look at this topic in detail, we will look at the evidence, basically. What evidence people used to use for the earlier view and what evidence people use now for the new view. Okay, that is everything for this video.